The following is brought to you by the Starfleet Podcast Network, SPN, The Spin.
Hey, this is Dag, and you're listening to Beyond Trek Podcast.
You know, we were on vacation for a couple of weeks, and then we got back, and my computer just won't be a computer. It's just slow, and some things it's just refusing to do.
Sometimes if the computer doesn't work like it's supposed to, just do concussive maintenance. Kick it, hit it, fire a phaser at it. I have found that sometimes that works. You never know.
Red alert.
Wanted to do a couple quick introductions. So my name is BigJ with Beyond Trek Podcast. And today acting as a co-host is our friend Boris, who comes from another podcast that's part of a network that Beyond Trek is a part of. And today our special guest is New York Times bestselling author Michael Jan Friedman. So thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with us to talk. And want to the number of books you have written, we couldn't sit here and name all of them. I mean, we could, but there are so many. And
there's a Wikipedia page, by the way.
Yes.
If anybody wants to look him up, Wikipedia page.
Yeah. I was looking through here to see, okay, which ones have you written that I've read? Books like Kalis, Reunion, Oblivion, another Kalis one, Shadows on the Sun, another Star Trek book. I know for sure I read Reunion. Some of these other ones look familiar, but I just don't recall. Crossover novel with the original series and Next Gen. So really you could scroll through here.
There's an X-Men too, right?
Yeah, there's a couple X-Men crossovers in there. So that's the first thing I want to ask about, because I'm interested about the X-Men crossover, especially and this was before X-Men? Because, Patrick Stewart was Professor X and of course Captain Picard. And if this crossover had been done after, that would have been kind of a strange explanation there. But can you tell me a little bit more about the X-Men and Star Trek crossover?
Yeah, it was actually done. And first of all, thank you for having me. It was done prior to Patrick Stewart's appearance in the X-Men movie. What happened is Marvel had the Star Trek license to do Star Trek comics at the time, and that relationship gave birth to the question, well, why don't we do a Star Trek X-Men crossover? And it was actually the second X-Men Star Trek crossover in the comics. But they said, okay, so now we're doing it in the comics. Hey, why don't we continue it in the form of a book? And that wasn't really quite within the purview of the license, but because there was a relationship already, they were able to do it. And John Ordover, who was the editor at the time of the Star Trek publishing program, asked me if I wanted to do a book. And he said, but you have to call it Planet X. And I said, sure, that's a great idea. So that's what we did. And it was about the most fun you could have as a writer, devising scenes in the hologram between in the holodeck between Worf and Wolverine, talking about Nightcrawler and Geordi. The two of them are talking about teleportation and so on. It was just a ton of fun, and I even was able to slip in a subtle little scene that I'm proud of. You have Archangel running around the Enterprise, flying around the Enterprise, and alarming people as he goes by. And in in a Next Generation episode called The Outrageous Akona, we met Terry Hatcher. She played a transporter operator named BG Robinson, if I'm not mistaken, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought, hey, Terry Hatcher, why don't I put her character, BG Robinson, in the book? And so she, of course, she plays, Lois Lane in the TV series. So she's standing there in one of the corridors as Archangel goes zooming by, and she says, "I can't believe a man can fly."
So, of all this technology,
it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of all the technology in the 24th century, that's where you're hung up.
Right. Yeah. But here's Lois Lane saying, "Can't believe it."
The Superman and Lois, the New Adventures of something. That's from the 90s. So definitely remember the show you're talking about.
Was the inspiration, because my inspiration for X-Men was the animated series, which was fairly true to the comics. Was that the inspiration for your characters in your book?
Lois and Clark, the New Adventures of Superman.
I actually bought X-Men 1 off the newsstand. Oh. So that was like 100 and some odd years ago, I think. and you
got the first one.
In fact, what I think happened is I had a tooth, like a wisdom tooth, pulled, and my father brought me to a store down the block from the dentist and said, "Here, go ahead, go buy a comic." And my parents were very, very supportive when it came to my buying comics, reading comics, and so I bought X-Men 1. I said, "What? X-Men? What's this?" Mm-hmm. My X-Men, as you'd see in my pure X-Men novel, Shadows of the Past, my X-Men are the original 5. So that was kind of my inspiration, even though the cast of X-Men in Planet X was not the original 5. That's how I entered the X-Men mythos.
Yeah, so no Jubilee, huh?
No Jubilee. What about Gambit? Oh no, Gambit wasn't part of the original 5.
No, he definitely wasn't. But I don't believe he's in this book. I remember Nightcrawler for sure, and Wolverine,
Cyclops, maybe.
Cyclops in it? I'm not sure. I think maybe he was.
Okay.
Honestly, I think he was.
Because I could see Cyclops and Geordi talking together. They've each got the visor thing going on. Here's the important question. Do you still have that issue, X-Men #1?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Unfortunately, it's not mint, but I do have it. I also have Avengers 1.
Wow. Nice. Well, still, if it's not mint, it's still, that could probably get you something at one of these comic book conventions.
If I were inclined to sell it.
Right. So then my next question is, why Star Trek? Why did you decide that Star Trek was what you're going to write for?
Well,
or write about?
I guess there are two answers to that. One is I was always interested in Star Trek. I like a lot like X-Men. I came in at the beginning. I think it was 11 years old when Star Trek debuted on NBC. So I was bowled over by that first episode, and I watched it every week. I watched every episode as it came out. I actually, for a long time, didn't watch any reruns. Because first of all, I didn't have to. I'd seen it all already. Uh-huh. And also I have a an allergy against watching things for the second time. For the most part, things I've watched more than once were either things I had to watch to get the details right in a book, or something that my kids liked.
So it's got to be really special to watch twice.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
For pleasure, not just to be clear, twice for pleasure, not for work.
Right.
Right. So, but I'm sure there are movies I've watched 40 times because my kids like them. But I did, so I was a big fan of Star Trek when it came out. The other answer is this: my first 4 books were for Warner Publishing, and they had a new line of science fiction and fantasy called Questar, and I did 4 books for them, and then they did okay. And then I was very happy with them. But, in terms of sales, they did okay. They were what they call mid-list. And at the end of those 4 books, I went into to talk to the editor, who was no longer the editor that hired me originally. In publishing terms, I was an orphan.
Okay.
And, the new editor who'd replaced her had no allegiance to me in particular. And editors love to bring in their own we'll call them victims, and fresh meat.
Yeah, rookies,
so
freshmen.
The guy who was younger than I was at the time, he said, Mike, it's been a good run, but I think we're going to go in another direction. And I was like, what? What do you mean another direction? Whatever direction you want to go in, I'll go with you. It's okay.
Right.
But he, he wasn't having it, and he said, we're gonna go in another direction. So, sayonara.
So you got the old "it's not you, it's me."
Yeah, right. So I walked out of there. I walked out of there, and I said, "Is this it? Is this could be it?" And by the way, if you told me when I was back in college that I was going to write 4 books, I would have signed up for that. So I would have signed up for 1. So the fact that he, was giving me the boot after 4 books, I said, all right, well, if that's it, maybe that's it. And then a couple of days later, I got a call from my agent, and she said, have you ever thought about writing a Star Trek book? And I said, I haven't, but I've enjoyed them. I'd actually read a few of them by Howie Weinstein and Ann Crispin, and who got into that before I did. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. Put words in the mouths of Kirk and Spock. Are you kidding? That'd be lots of fun. And it came at a fortuitous time because, I had just lost my gig at Warner. So
you were looking for work?
I'm sorry?
I said, so you were looking for work because that was good timing.
I was. Well, although I wasn't actually looking, I was more like, I would say, despondent.
Okay.
So I hadn't gotten to the stage yet where I said, okay, now I have to look for something. So I prepared an outline and I gave it to Dave Stern, who was the editor of the publishing program at that time. And he called me back and after reading it, and he said, Mike, this is exactly what we are not looking for. This is a fantasy novel with starring Scotty and a bunch of Scottish myths. He goes, we're science fiction. He goes, I know it's kind of loose science fiction.
You went with the Scotty book as your first one?
Yeah, well, that was my proposal. So,
okay.
So
because
not what eventually came out, because he said no. So he said, give me a good Star Trek science fiction story. So I went back and I've always been kind of interested in shining lights in dark corners, tying up loose ends. And I rewatched again, a rare thing for me. What are little girls made of? The android episode. And I said, wait a second, there could be another Kirk android lurking around here, right? So I came up with a story about a Kirk android being created in that cavernous lair and taking over the Enterprise from Kirk. And I said, okay, so here's a good story. And I submitted it to Dave, and Dave said, he goes, Mike, this is great. This is terrific. He goes, but how does it end? And I said, oh, well, I didn't want to spoil it for you.
I've got the last page right here. You don't get it.
He goes, Mike, I'm the editor. I'm the editor. I'm a professional. You can spoil it for me. So I gave him the ending. It had to do with Romulans and so on. And he said, this is great. And let's go with this. And that became Double Double, which was my first Star Trek book. And then I finished that. And by then, Next Generation had started to come out. And Dave said, well, that was a great book. What are you going to do next? And I said, I think I'd like to do a Next Generation story. And so I did a story called A Call to Darkness. And then it went on from there. It's like, it's sort of like in The Princess Bride, I'll probably kill you in the morning, but in the meantime, here's another book. So I went, through these 1-book contracts. I must have gone through 30 of them. And occasionally it was a trilogy or in one case, even 6 books. But for the most part, it was a series of 1-book contracts.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about the process by which you come up with a Star Trek story. As far as my limited knowledge of creativity goes, I'm not a very creative person. Normally, it's taking an existing plot device from the 30s or the 40s or the 50s. That was an original concept back then, and then twisting it in a way that would be better for more modern audiences. I'm assuming in the years or in the decade that you're writing. But what's the process like when you're trying to write for characters that have appeared through somebody else's work and you're trying to continue the legacy of those characters?
Well, there are different ways to do it. One is, as I said, to shine a light on some aspect of what's been established about them. For instance, I did a 4-issue comic series called Shadowheart about Worf's human brother, which ran into some problems because we were getting to the end of the Next Generation run, and we'd mentioned Worf's human brother, but we hadn't actually seen him. So I said, okay, so this is fair game. And halfway through the process of writing it, what comes down the pike, a script about Worf's human brother, which was nothing like what I had in mind. So that was a torturous process to kind of bring that in line with.
You have to start all over then. Yeah. You have to kind of work with canon, if you will.
The books have to follow canon, but the canon is not beholden to the books.
Right.
So basically what they did, and it sounds like they did, is completely trash the book. I mean, did that just, were you anywhere close to it, or was it like okay, you guys just detonated my book, now I have to do something else?
Well, it was a comic series. It was a 4-issue comic series. So I had outlined all four comics. I had written the first one, plotted out the second one. The first one was being penciled, was about to be inked. So we were down, we'd already gone down that road, but not far enough where we could say, look, there's nothing we could do here. So we had to kind of rewrite what was going on, use as much of the finished artwork, finished pencils as we could to avoid having to pay everybody twice. So it was torturous, but you know what?
Here's a very important question. That's
completely
irrelevant.
When I was writing the Star Trek comic,
I have a very important question that's completely irrelevant. Did Worf's brother in your novel have a Russian accent?
Did he have a Russian accent?
Well, the guy's name is Rozhenko, right?
Yeah, I don't think he did. I don't think he did. I think I made him speak in such a way that it seemed perhaps that English was not his first language, but I didn't make him speak with a Russian accent. But then again, the Klingons, there were tons of Klingons in those comics. They didn't speak with accents either. Right. Yeah. but the point is that I like to answer your question. The point is that I like to shine light on dark corners, pick up threads that had been, dropped. That was one thing. And the other thing that I did sometimes is I said, what's the last thing that this character wants to see in his life or her life? What can we do to really, really find a wound and rub salt in it? That's another thing. So it's always driven by character initially. But the way you get there is not always the same.
Is it easier to write for comics than it is for, which I'm sure I'm probably know the obvious answer to that, but is it easier writing for comics than it is for paperback novels?
It's easier writing comics than novels. It's not necessarily easier writing comics than short stories. And I have written some Star Trek short stories because, you're dealing with a more finite set of events and characters. And I actually think the short story, which more or less corresponds to a comic, a single issue of the comic, I think that's actually the best format for science fiction is the short story, because you get in, you say, here's the scientific concept, here's the ramifications of it, social, psychological, whatever they may be, and you get out. So as much as I love writing novels and as much as I love reading novels, I actually think pound for pound, the short form is better.
You mean like specifically for Star Trek with kind of what you're trying to get out of that story, right?
Well, I think for science fiction,
or just in general,
science fiction in general.
Oh, okay. Science fiction.
I'm not sure about literature in general, but I think certainly for science fiction.
Yeah, I think it's hard to put Shakespeare in a comic book.
I could not imagine writing Shakespeare for a comic.
It has been done. I was a teacher for 15 years, and one of the things I used to do is teach Macbeth in comic form.
You taught Macbeth in comic form?
That very well.
That seems very difficult.
There was an occasion, this was back when the Star Trek Coda book series, which was going to be the wrap up of what was in the current Litverse Star Trek. So we had interviews with Dayton Ward, David Mack, and James Swallow about that. And one of the things that they talked about that I wanted to get your take on is, so the books were needed to follow the canon, but not the other way around. And there was, what they said was there was kind of also, I don't know if you want to use canon as the right word, but the authors kind of tried to not completely do 180s of what other writers have done. And was there like an initial early on kind of collaboration where, hey, I'm going to say that Uhura is from here and her parents' name were this and that. And another author doesn't just take it as, okay, well, I'm going to do completely different than what you are. I'm basically going to say that she was born in a whole different area, was adopted, didn't have a parent, whatever it was it more of a cooperative, trying to keep all of yourselves in a general sort of, we're not stepping on each other's toes, but you still have your own work that you're doing? You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Initially, when there weren't as many Star Trek books, I think we did do that. We tried hard to not step on each other's toes, to not rewrite stories that others had written. But as the publishing program went forward, things were rewritten. And it had to do, to some extent, with the editor. The editor, as I said before, writers can be orphans. And I think stories can be orphans too. And so there were stories of mine, stories of others that were rewritten under the philosophy that nothing should stand in the way of a good story. A philosophy, by the way, that I'm dead set against.
Okay.
To me, everything has to fit together. You want to live in that world. You want it to be seamless. So if I'm contradicting something that you read earlier in the Star Trek publishing program, it's like pulling aside the curtain. Like, hey, I know this is not what you saw before, but let's try this on now. So I'm not actually in favor of that, but the editors, to some extent, were, and that was their philosophy, that they wanted to do whatever they could to produce a good Star Trek story. There was an instance, by the way. There was an instance where, there's actually been a few little tidbits here and there where the publishing program actually did inform the screen products. For instance, in terms of tidbits, the first names of Sulu and Uhura were originally appeared in the books.
I think I do recall that right? It started in the books. Yeah. The bigger exception would be in the Day of Honor series. We, in the publishing program, came up with a concept. I say we, I had nothing to do with it. The concept of the Day of Honor, the Klingon Day of Honor. And I ended up writing two of the 5 books in that series, but I didn't develop it. And then when the Star Trek editor was talking, the Star Trek publishing editor was talking to Jerry Taylor at Voyager about what he was doing, she said, "Wait a second, Day of Honor. Tell me more about that. That's interesting." And so the Day of Honor concept actually started in the publishing program and wound up as an episode in the Voyager series, which, by the way, we then novelized. Oh,
so it went
okay.
From publishing to screen to publishing, and
is that the one that was directed by, or the screenplay was written by Ronald Moore? At the one where B'Elanna was in the Klingon purgatory, if you will.
Yes.
She had to rescue her mother,
right?
Yeah. Well, she went to Grethor, which is
Grethor. There you go. Yeah, right. So yes, that's the one.
That was a good episode, by the way. So that episode was inspired by a book series you were involved in. So, and that has to be a pretty important accomplishment, at least that you would see, would be to have something that is written that you wrote or were involved in that gets picked up as we're taking this and making it an official thing that started in the books. So
it was.
I'm sure you're happy about that.
I didn't develop that book series, but I also co-wrote an episode of Voyager, so that was an even greater thrill, you'd say, to become forever and ever some small part of the Star Trek screen product machine.
Now, there was one of our other members in our network of Star Trek podcasts that wanted to join but was not able to, and she's an aspiring writer. So I want to ask the question that I'm sure that she had is, with someone that's aspiring to be a writer and be an author, is there that one good piece of advice or place to start to get that going? Like where did you, how was your start, and what would you recommend to anyone who says, hey, I want to be a writer, I want to write novels?
Well, I did everything ass backwards. I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, it just worked out for me, but you're supposed to get an agent before you get a gig, and things, you're not supposed to start out writing novels. You write short stories and then you develop a following. I didn't do that. But in terms of what I tell aspiring writers, the number one thing is finish what you start. What often happens is I hear people, they come to me and say, look, I had this great idea and I got about 50 pages down the road, and then it petered out. I got writer's block. And writer's block is not this mystical thing. There's always a reason for it. It's always a different reason. Most often people get what they call writer's block because they haven't thought about what comes after that 50 pages. They have this great idea, this scene, this problem for one of their characters, but they don't know how to resolve it, which is why when you're a young or aspiring writer, you have to write an outline. You can't write by the seat of your pants when you're inexperienced. Later on, maybe. But initially, you need an outline. The outline has to take you to the end of the story. And then you write the entire story. Whether it's 50 pages or 300 pages, you finish it, because you can't get any benefit from having written the beginning until you've gotten to the end. It's not uncommon, even when you have an outline, for you to get to the end and say, well, wait, I thought I was writing about this, when in fact I was writing about that. And I need to change the beginning. So you don't get any mileage out of that until you write the end. So always finish what you start. That's one thing. Another thing that I tell aspiring writers is become an apprentice. And by that, I mean, if in the old days, you wanted to become a blacksmith, you would find a blacksmith and you would apprentice yourself to that person. And you would work for little or nothing, learning the tools of your trade. And then, once you were good enough, you would go out on your own. We get the P word drummed into us as young students, the plagiarism word. Don't plagiarize. Find your own voice. And finding your voice could take decades. Mm-hmm. So what you do is you find an author that you admire and try to write a book in that author's voice, and apprentice yourself in effect to that author. And then once you master that, you will naturally find your own variation on that. But there's nothing wrong with, I used to idolize a science fiction writer named Roger Zelazny, a Hugo Award winner, and just a tremendous poetic writer. And so the first 3 books I wrote were books he could have written, right? I happened to write them, but he could have, and they were professional and they published them. But I was inspired by him, and I wrote books that I thought his readers would enjoy. And that's a good strategy. It's a good way to go.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
So shining light in dark corners.
Mm-hmm.
On the answer you just gave me. The first question is, what happens when, and again, I'm not a writer, but what happens when you have writer's block at your outline? You don't know, you have a certain point, then you just don't know how to end it. How do you deal with that? And then number two would be, how will do you think AI or ChatGPT or something similar either assist or take over that kind of writing scheme that you're talking about writing somebody else's voice?
Right. Okay. Well, in terms of what do you do in your outline? You're asking, what do you do in your outline if you just can't get to the next step?
Yeah. Like, for example, you get to a certain point, you get to the middle of the story, everything's great, you got all sorts of characters and whatnot, and then you're just like, wait a minute, what happens from this point on? I don't know what to do. Like, I'm here. What happens?
So you're on the outline and get stuck.
Yeah.
It's a good question. So you have to understand that a story is about someone solving a problem, right?
Right.
So, and it might be multiple problems. You might have one big problem and then some smaller problems. Your big problem is the Green Goblin, and your smaller problems are, how do I get the girl and what do I do with these powers, right? So, what you do is you say, who's my character? What are my character's problems? And the way it works is you work in 3 acts. In the first act, you meet the characters and the conflict or the problem. And the character at the end of the first act, your main character, comes up against the problem and is insufficient to solving it. Not equipped, not experienced enough, doesn't have the right ordnance, whatever it might be. Character falls short of solving the problem. The second act is about the struggle, and 2 things are happening. There are 2 threads that are taking place in the second act. One is the stakes are getting higher and higher, and time is getting shorter, right? Like, action's rising. This is not looking good. But the other, at the same time, is the character is slowly getting equipped to handle that problem through his experiences, through things he acquires, through, the magic sword that he found. So even though the stakes are getting higher, he's also getting better equipped to, I say he, obviously it could be anybody, to face that problem. At the end of the second act, you get into the climax. Here's the character facing the problem once again, except this time the character is in a position to emerge victorious. And then you have a little denouement. So that's it. Once you know, and you can find this out by looking at the rest of your outline, once you know who the character is and what the problem is, you know what to do. You may not know exactly how the character is going to solve the problem, but this is writing. It's not supposed to be easy.
Thank God we invented the whatever device.
Right. So now the second part of your question.
The typewriter? The keyboard?
Whatever. The second part of your question is in terms of AI. AI scares the crap out of me, because I'm pretty sure that even though AI is very rudimentary now and very silly and very boilerplate, that the time will come when it's able to write, I think, as well as pretty much anybody. And this is a big part of the Writers Guild strike, because in the last contract, which was in 2008, they didn't know anything about AI. It wasn't contemplated in the contract, nor were some other things like streaming. But AI needs a template, right? So you can't just say, go write a great story. It's like, well, what do you mean? What's a great story? How do I know if it's great? Well, go write a story like this writer. And then you feed that a book from that writer in there, and it can write a story in that writer's voice, the kind of story that writer would write. And I'm sure at some point down the road, 10, 15 years, whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be a legitimately great book. So the question is, well, there are a couple of questions. One is, how do we compensate that writer, either in terms of a book or in terms of a screenplay, for the fact that his work was used as a template, right? So the writer has to be compensated. The other thing is, I think, just as bookstores survive, even though there are alternatives, I think books written by human beings will always survive. I mean, you could take a picture of the Mona Lisa and put it in your living room, but it's not the same as having the real Mona Lisa. The real Mona Lisa was written by a human. It was painted by a human being.
We get it,
right?
Yeah.
Right, painted by a human being, and that's part of its value to you. So I think books written by human beings will always have a certain value that AI written books don't. But again, nonetheless, it scares the crap out of me.
I've got a question, and I apologize for not knowing this. I feel like I should in regard to the writer's strike. But can you expand a little more on what is it with the AI part that is that piece of I didn't know that was part of the reason behind the strike. Is that just one of the things? Is like a major part of it?
It's a major part. It's a major part. There are three things. One is we need a raise because the last contract was 15 years ago. Money's $1 is not what it was back in 2008. So that's money, and that's always going to be part of a contract negotiation.
I heard the billionaires were claiming that you guys are being unreasonable. So isn't it nice when isn't it nice when the billionaires tell the working class, hey, work with us here. You guys are just you're being jerks. Really?
Yeah, well, those companies couldn't survive without those billionaires.
Right? I know.
But anyway, I have a feeling that those guys would, instead of $20 million, I have a feeling they would take $3 million. If that was their only alternative, I have a feeling they would take it. But anyway, neither here nor there. Mm-hmm. So a raise. Second part is AI, because again, back in 2008, there was no provision for how we would be compensated when we're used as templates for AI generated works. So going forward, that has to be a part of the contract. And the third part is streaming. The way it works. So I wrote this Star Trek episode, and initially you get paid for it for the first time it runs. And then when it reruns, because all the Star Trek episodes ran a second time, right? When it runs again, you get less, but you still get something. And then when it runs a third time in Paris, then you get more money. And when it runs again in New Zealand, you get more money. And it's less each time, but you're compensated for each broadcast. With streaming, it doesn't work that way. With streaming, I might on a Tuesday morning decide to access an episode of Strange New Worlds, and you might access it 3 days later. And right, so everybody.
How do you track that metric?
There's no broadcast, and so there's no. So you can't count the number of broadcasts, and therefore the number of times you get paid. So there has to be a different, like you say, a different metric, more along the lines, I think, of what we see in the music industry, maybe. Every time something's accessed, it's counted, and the musician is compensated poorly, very poorly, but nonetheless, the technology is there to track that kind of thing. But that's the third part of what needs to be resolved.
Yeah, I think it's like, imagine in Voyager, right? The reason why Tom Paris exists, even though he's the same actor and not Nicholas Locarno, is because Paramount didn't want to pay the writer for the Locarno episode, because every time Locarno would be used, he'd have to get compensated for every episode of Voyager, right? So it's the same principle. And then, the big thing is, what database is being used to source the material, and how do you know you're part of that database of the work that's being used to source for AI to generate your work? So, that's part of it, where you're trying to establish, okay, so if that's going to happen, which it's going to have to happen, because how else is AI going to get information to process, right? So what database is to be established, and who's part of that database, and how you get compensated, even though you're in the database, but your work's not used. Although it could take it from your work, and you may not know it because it could only take a line or two, so that's
true. Yep. True.
That's really a huge issue, because then if the writer's not compensated, now you're going on, copyright infringement, but no one will ever discover copyright infringement because it's so buried deep in the code of what you're using. And then people are going to make more money off your work, and you're not going to get fairly compensated for it. So it's a huge mess.
It sounds like this, and I can tell you from my professional perspective on technology, this sounds like something that I couldn't even think of what would be a good solution to that, because you're talking about those metrics again of how would anyone be able to really know, or to say that my book was used in this AI template? Because you're right. Now you're starting to get into the database and the coding, which is not easy. That's not easy to do. And when it comes to the streaming part, you have to now implement a system where each time a particular episode, like this episode, is aired, you have to have some tally mark for it. Honestly, to me, I can tell you that that's a nightmare. The whole, and this is probably why there's a strike, and it may be going on for a while, because I'm sure there's a solution out there. There's got to be. What it could be, no idea, because you really are talking about things that are very hard to track and to quantify. So
I think the AI would be easier if you just established the databases that could be fed into AI, and then whoever is on that list gets compensated for a portion of the, whatever is used.
Well, you could start out. One thing that makes this a little easier is, that everything an AI generates is based on something.
Right.
So every time you have an AI generated product, you have to compensate someone. So presumably, if it's someone, you don't care who it is, you might as well be honest and say, oh, it was that guy. That's who we copied, So having the imperative to compensate someone simplifies it somewhat. It's true, you could compensate the wrong guy, but
that's what I was just thinking. The wrong guy.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by that is, if you establish a pool, for example, Sci-Fi AI pool, right? Who are the science fiction authors that are, like, for example, in scientific literature, since I'm in the science field, in the scientific literature, you go to ResearchGate or PubMed or whatever, you have a list of highly cited authors, right? So similar kind of perspective, you create a database of the highest cited authors of, works in science fiction, create that pool. These are the people whose information will be used to generate AI content for sci-fi series. And you got the drama, you got the criminal, you got whatever. You have your different pools, and you have individuals that get compensated if somebody chooses to use AI generated content for TV shows, streaming, movies, whatever, right? If you don't, right, you just hire the one schmuck or the three schmucks that will write the script for you, right? Then you just pay them, right? Or if you want AI assist, you pay the other people that's work that you use, and then you have the ability, or supposedly you would be given the ability, like your works would be. It's like, Michael, would you want to be part of this pool? You get compensated, whatever it is, whatever the compensation rate is. This is how much you can get as a residual check over time, yada yada yada. Would you consent to have all your works be part of this pool? And you can say, presumably, yes or no, right? It's like, you
could do that, but science fiction writers are notoriously accepting of newbies, and so so to say that there's this, it becomes an exclusive list, and the barriers to entry are completely different than they are in academia.
Sure.
So let's say some Ron Moore comes along straight out of college and says, I have a great story. You can't say, the other science fiction writers wouldn't say, go away. We already have our list. We're all getting compensated. It kind of runs contrary to our philosophy. And by the way, it runs contrary to Star Trek, right? I mean, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. We're the opposite of exclusive.
Right.
You're right. I could see that as the drawback to a system like that, because then you have someone fresh out of school that already slides right into the residual pool and didn't put in their time, which I get what you're saying in regards to not being so inclusive that the new guys are shunned away. But it's kind of like,
right.
We've got this thing. We've been doing it for all these years. We negotiated this. And now I'm going to pretend like I'm one of those people that has a solution, because everyone does. We all know how to end the strike, right? So
totally right. Of course.
I've got it.
What are you talking about?
Michael, do you know who I need to talk to about resolving this writer's strike? Because I got it right here. So all you do, it's simple. All you have to do is once the billionaires decide that the writers are worth getting a little more money, once they kind of bring themselves off of their yachts and their helicopters and say, okay, well, we can kick a little more over. Has that idea been entertained that, it's going to be a nightmare to try to quantify every click of a stream or any book that gets fed into the system? So here's the base pay you get, and here's like a flat residual. Some of you might get more than what you would have. Some may get less, but let's try to be all on the same page here and help ourselves out and have a solution here that at least you can live with. Like I could live with a new guy coming in and sliding right into something like that. I'm not so selfish that I would want to make sure. It's kind of like with student loans. I paid all mine. You shouldn't have to get yours compensated or not, which I think that is the most asinine thought behind that is, we don't want you to get your student loans forgiven because someone else had to go and do theirs. Such a selfish, nothing sums up America than a phrase like that. So what are your thoughts? And if you're able to tell us, if you're in the know, has something like that been floated, of like a flat base salary and then a flat base residual?
It'd be tough because most writers are freelancers. Even staff writers spend most of their lives as freelancers. So I'm, I would say I was a showrunner, and now I'm a freelancer, and I'm going to go to my friend who I hired when I was a showrunner and say, hey, cut me a break, give me an opening, and I write a script for him. And then the next year I'm a showrunner again. And, but on and off, most even staff writers are freelancers. So it's hard to say, here's a salary.
Okay.
And if they did, it would be so very low because they'd be including so many people who might not be productive. There'd be a disincentive to be more productive. It's a tough question. But there has been a system. It's just a question, I think, of adapting it. We had a system whereby there are rates that you get. When you write a story for a Star Trek or for any network program, you get a certain amount. It's set in stone. And when you write a script based on that story, you get a certain amount set in stone. And when someone comes along and tinkers with your work, they get a certain amount set in stone. So there are set amounts. You just have to find a way to apply them to today's delivery systems, content delivery systems.
I am looking forward to seeing how this resolves because I'll be laying awake at night thinking, okay, if I was them, what would be the technical solution to this? Because it is a technical one. You're dealing with streaming and AI, and how do you incorporate that? I'm sure hopefully have tech people at the table to offer in how do we do this with the numbers and the binaries and the digits and the IP addresses and who clicks on what and all of that.
And also the biggest people or the biggest entities that want this resolved are the states, because California, Georgia, they're losing billions.
Oh yeah,
and New York.
And New York too, yeah. I mean, it's billions of dollars a day of just lost revenue for everybody.
Well, yes, they're they still have inventory. The networks and the streaming services, they still have inventory, but that won't last forever.
Right. Well, no, but like the states want those tax dollars.
Yes, they do.
For booking locations, for the business fees and all that stuff. They want all that revenue. They're losing billions of dollars a day because of it. So they want that resolved. Anyways, going back to Star Trek here for a sec.
Oh, that's right. You were talking about Star Trek.
But tying in AI, has there actually more questions, right? Number one is, do you know a lot of the other Star Trek authors, and do you guys have your own like little clique when you're writing stories? And then number two, has anybody written? I can't put my finger on it. Has anybody written a story with like a helpful AI as opposed to one that wants to destroy the universe?
Well, so in answer to your question, yes, I have the great good fortune of being friends with lots of the people you'd identify as the most prolific Star Trek authors and screenwriters as well. So yeah,
you've got the Rolodex.
They're all great people and excellent writers, and we have a great time together. We see each other at conventions. We help each other promote books, and it's one. That's something that science fiction is not quite unique in, but is almost unique. We'll say is that there's a community, right?
It's more Federation-esque.
Community of fans. There's a community of writers, and it's a privilege. It's a real privilege to be part of that community, either of those communities, actually. So yeah, I know a lot of those galoots. And I think they'd admit to knowing me too.
Maybe, right? Slip them a 20.
The other part of that, what was the other part of the question?
The question is, has anybody written a story that has a helpful AI, not just one that wants to destroy the universe, or all sentient life? You know what I'm talking about, right? Like,
yeah,
computer goes out of control.
I think there's no story that I know of about that, but I think that's an assumption in almost every story that comes out now. You know, we're no longer quite so allergic to computers. We're not as scared of computers. Maybe we should be, but we're not. I think it's a subtext in very many stories that the computer is a helpful tool. We just don't, it's just that's not the main thrust of the story, but it's an assumption.
Right. And I was just curious now that, all this, a lot of this strike is based on AI, and, it's being more prominent over the years. And a lot of people spell doom and gloom, right? Because of our wonderful science fiction authors that talk about doom and gloom with AIs taking over, the Matrix and whatnot. But it's outside of maybe something like Halo, where you have an AI implant where it helps you target logs or something, or it helps you with logical calculations. There aren't very many stories where you have an AI as an assist to trying to solve a lot of your problems. It's more like humans are being threatened.
I just thought of this quote, this line I read from James Cameron. This is recent. I'm getting some of the wording right. The wording incorrect, I'm sure, but it was something like, "I warned all of you about this in 1984 and you didn't listen." That was when Terminator.
I'll tell you, I am not. Listen, where society's going in an AI direction, no matter what the three of us do or don't do, right? Yep. It's going to happen.
Hey, I can pull the plug on AI because I can.
You can?
No.
We should talk because I think there's a legitimate problem. Obviously there's a lot of things that AI can do to help us. There's, from a medical standpoint, from a resource generation and deployment standpoint, there are lots of things that AI can do to help us. But ultimately, my concern is this. So there's an incentive, an economic incentive for sure, right, to develop more and more sophisticated systems. Presumably, we will stop or be stopped from creating a system that's more powerful than what we can control. We, meaning, responsible society, responsible government, and so on like that. But not everyone on Earth is responsible in that way. So let's say you have a terrorist organization that has access to technology, and we know that there are some that do, and they take that computer that's just about as smart as we are, and they use it to create a computer that's smarter than we are, that has no particular, it's not beholden to Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics, and it doesn't really care what happens to us, right? That's what scares me. And I think it's very, very possible and even likely that that'll happen.
Well,
that's my concern.
I'm glad we have that episode of Star Trek where James T. Kirk asked the robot to find the last digit of pi, and then
that's all we have to do.
Well,
to shut them down. That's all we have.
I guess that sounds good. I now I can sleep at night.
We can all sleep now.
Unless it becomes smart, just replies with, "There is no last digit of pi. Next question."
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, man.
Oh. Now I'm not sleeping again.
Jeez. Yeah. Well, Michael, I want to say thank you so much for taking out time in your day to join us and talk about the novels, comics, crossovers, and just everything, all of your work that you've done. Is there anything that you have coming up that you want to talk about, mention, promote, make sure we all know about?
Yeah, there are a few things.
Okay.
One is, and my colleague, I'm part of a group called Crazy 8 Press, which we founded about 12 years ago. It's where we, meaning the 10 writers that are involved in Crazy 8, express our most authentic visions, right? So if I want to write a book about a 21st century Aztec Empire noir murder mystery, I can do it through Crazy 8 Press. I don't have to go to a traditional publisher. And I did, by the way, with that. And to a friend who is an editor at one of the publishing houses. And she said, I love that idea. What a great idea. I can't buy that idea. Can you imagine, taking that to a bookstore buyer and saying, yeah, it's a 21st century Aztec Empire noir murder mystery. The guy's head would explode. So at Crazy 8, we don't need to generate the numbers that a traditional publishing house needs to generate. And we can publish things that we want to write, desperately want to write. And presumably our readers will, we hope, desperately want to read. So that's Crazy 8. So right now we have an anthology being kickstarted. It's an anthology of holiday science fiction and fantasy stories called Grandma Got Kidnapped by Aliens and Other Stories. And Other Holidays Gone Wrong, I think, right? So please look that up. Grandma Got Kidnapped by Aliens. It's a Kickstarter campaign. It's about halfway through, and it can use some help. So that's one thing I'd like to plug. My story in there is about an Aztec priest who has just gone through a sacrifice cycle for one of the holidays to appease the rain god, and is told that no, that didn't work. We're going to try the harvest gods now. And he looks around and he goes, who's left to sacrifice? I went through like 200 people just now. I can't even move my hands. And that's how that story begins. So they're not all Judeo-Christian holiday stories. Another thing I'd like to mention is our Phenomenons series. Phenomenons is a superhero anthology. We've put out 2 volumes now, and we're going to put out a third soon. We're going to kickstart a third in February. It's a world where we never got over the financial crisis of 2008, and people are hurting, and they need superheroes more than perhaps than you and I. And it's a really refreshing, interesting group of superheroes that have been that we've designed. We have some terrific writers, including Jeff Thorne, who writes Green Lantern for DC, and Dan Hernandez, who most recently collaborated with his partner on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movie. So we have some terrific writers. We have Nebula and Hugo Award nominees. The superheroes themselves are as familiar as, we have a speedster written by Paul Kupperberg, who's written 1 million comic books and novels. So he's a speedster. He's a different kind of speedster. And then we have completely original, crazy characters like Lipstick Lily. Lipstick Lily fights crime with an array of specialty lipsticks.
Okay.
So it's a really cool anthology. And if you haven't seen the first 2 volumes, you should get those on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, and look for the Kickstarter in February. And the third thing that I should mention is something called Empty Space. A couple of years ago, I kickstarted a graphic novel called Empty Space about a Star Trek, vaguely Star Trek-like situation where there's a Federation type organization, but its ships are far flung, and there's a problem in that people die, and they can't easily be replaced. They don't just pop into a nearby starbase and get some more crew, and they don't have room to come up with robot replacements. So what they do is they've developed a technology where they can reanimate their crew just once, and only for about a year before they start to go berserk. And so these are called empties because they're kind of empty of emotion. And our protagonist wakes up as an empty in an era that he's not familiar with, and on a ship that kind of looks like his, and he's been, we'll call it, asleep for a while. And it's his reintroduction into the universe that becomes the meat of the stories. So that's Empty Space. And so a couple of years ago, I did the graphic novel, and pretty soon I'm going to be kickstarting the prose sequel. So it's going to be a prose novel that's a sequel to a graphic novel. I've never done that before. I don't know what that'll be like, but we're going to give it a shot.
Well, something new always sounds like fun. Well, that's great. We should definitely take I'm sorry, what's that, Boris? Oh, I thought you were saying.
I think there's like a tagline. There's like a tagline in there, like, Crazy 8 Publishing. Come spend time with the 10 of us.
Sorry, spend time with the what?
With the 10 of us, right? Because you mentioned there are 10 people.
Well, when we started out, there were only 6.
Well, that's like the Big Ten has 12 teams and the Big 12 has 10 teams, or all that stuff. Right. It's like, it doesn't even make any sense anymore.
Yeah. Well, that's the crazy part, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a great way to turn that right back around. I can tell you're a writer. That was excellent. Well, thanks again so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We should do this again sometime. Hopefully this writer strike ends at some point so you can maybe get back into doing some work, some projects. So appreciate it. Appreciate everyone for watching and listening to Beyond Trek Podcast. And as always, live long and prosper.
We are Beyond Trek Podcast. Lower your inhibitions and surrender your ears. We will add inspirational and hilarious Trek content to your day. Your attention will adapt to subscribe to us. Resistance is futile.